In a recent article published by The Atlantic, the article argues that the U.S. has been so saturated with cynicism that it's threatening some of our most basic institutions, including politics and science. The piece, entitled American Cynicism Has Reached a Breaking Point, delves into how the U.S. got here and whether American culture can meet the moment and rise above the rancor. Megan Garber is the author behind that article and is joining us now with a little more insight. So Megan, very, very interesting article. You write that we are being fed a steady diet of cynicism. It's packaged as information, it's packaged as entertainment, but it is sort of chipping away at us. It's making us distrustful and it's making us vulnerable. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of cynicism and, in particular, how news organizations play a role?
Certainly. Thank you so much for having me. I was thinking a lot about the big lie as, something that every citizen right now is contending with, this idea that, Donald Trump had the election stolen from him, which, it's called the big lie for a reason. That certainly was not the case. And I was just thinking about what it feels like to live in the culture where the big lie just seems to be kind of everywhere. And I think that, news organizations, even in talking about the big lie, even right now when I'm talking about the big lie, in some ways we feed that, and in some ways it sort of puts the lie and the untruths into the air. And I think what that can do, I was thinking very personally for me, what that feels like as a news consumer and a citizen, and it makes me feel, I think, so hopeless and desperate in a way. I think it primes me as a person to mistrust the news in general when I keep hearing something that I know is not true. And I think if you take that out to a macro level of sort of what this means for the country, it really is dangerous, because I think it can lead to a point where essentially no one trusts anything anymore, where if you don't like a truth, if you find a truth to be inconvenient to your own particular worldview, you can simply say, well, no, I don't believe that. That's a lie. And if we get to that point as a culture, I'm not quite sure where we go, because, for a democracy, you need truth, you need common facts and all of that.
Megan, your piece was absolutely fascinating, as is all your writing. One of the things that I wrote down, a public that doesn't know how to look at things squarely is a public that is primed to be manipulated. And Anne-Marie and I have talked about this before, because, and we've tried to figure out in talking to each other, just based on our own experience and the books that we've read, when this started to happen in America. And I think a lot of people would look at perhaps the last 10 years and say, oh yeah, that's when things started to happen, when birtherism became common belief by some people in this country. But you actually point to a couple of instances, and you specifically cite a book that was written in 1962, The Image, A Guide to Pseudo-Events in America by Daniel Boorstin. And I'm just curious what your research has led you to understand about how we take in information. I've had friends of mine who are supporters of President Trump text me things, and I'm basically like, so everything, what are you telling me? Everything that your teachers, your priests, and your rabbi, and your science teachers, and your doctors, everything that they've ever told you is a lie? You only believe this one person, or you only believe this one talking head on television? I find that incredibly difficult to understand.
I think one of the things about cynicism is that it really is a mindset to me. It's not just about, this one fact that I don't like, so I'm not going to see it, but it really becomes a way of seeing the world, where I think you can start to believe that there are things that are more important than truth. Your political party perhaps is more important than truth. Your value system in general is more important than truth. And I think once that mindset sets in, it really becomes possible to essentially look at the world without actually seeing it, where you can say, well, that someone argues that, but that's not a fact, even if the someone is, the scientific institutions that we have in this country. Even if the thing that is making the argument should be believed, because we have spent, hundreds of years building up institutions that are there to express the truth, you, I think, as a person, can very easily tell yourself, no, they're not on my team. I don't agree with them. And that can lead you to simply unsee the world. And so that's why I'm so interested in this topic, because just like you said, I think it's very much about a mindset and sort of a habit of mistrust that can really be applied to anything, and I think a very dangerous way.
Yeah, and I think the cynicism that we've seen over the past few years is being packaged or marketed as a search for the truth. The fact that you are a cynic is proof that you don't just accept anything. And Vlad, you talk about the arguments that you've had with friends. I've had arguments with friends, and I'm thinking about, the attack on the Capitol, where, people have said to me, Antifa was there, and I've said, no, Antifa wasn't there. And they said, can you prove Antifa wasn't there? And I said, well, the FBI did an investigation and they said Antifa wasn't there. And the response was, you believe the FBI? And so that was basically the end of the conversation, because, if the FBI isn't sort of the last word in an investigation, then we're talking two different languages. We have a different view of the world. So anyways, I say that, I called it marketed because cynicism is a strategy, and we've seen it happen before. And you point to Merchants of Doubt, which really looked into the strategy that the tobacco industry used to lie about the health implications of its product. It was a strategy, not just kind of not just a general mindset. It was a specific attempt at creating cynicism within its, customer base. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how the Trump administration used a similar strategy in some cases?
Sure. So yeah, exactly that. The book argues that the tobacco industry essentially tried to create chaos around the very definite scientific finding that tobacco is dangerous, which is, in some ways that's something we all know, but I think, science will always leave just a little bit of question. That's how science works, right? Everything is sort of a theory, and everything, is put forward and tested, and there's a rigorous means of testing and all of that. But what the book argues, I think, very compellingly, is that the tobacco industry found ways to sort of weaponize that little bit of remaining doubt that will happen in science and sort of give people a reason to say, well, the science isn't 100% about that. So they would fund studies that existed not to refute the science that was already done, but that existed simply to be there and to create noise and to create chaos and to give the tobacco industry an opportunity to say, well, these other studies say something else, and leave it at that. So very much a weaponization of cynicism. And it's something, too, I would say, that you can see in the climate change debate. And the book points this out as well, that we saw oil companies using a very similar playbook when it came to, the science about climate change and global warming and all of that. And I think we see it too with, the big lie with Donald Trump, and with this idea that if you repeat the falsehood often enough, and if you sort of assume that people want a reason not to believe, you can do a lot with that. Once you make that leap, that gives you a lot of power as a merchant of information and of narrative.
I often wonder, Megan and Anne-Marie, how much education plays a role in this. I understand that there are some highly educated people who believe some of these lies, but I just mean education at the fundamental level, the things that you actually absorb as you are educated in our society. Because when I see ads by oil companies touting green initiatives, my BS meter goes off. When I see ads from the food industry talking about the benefits of a particular product, which I know to not be healthy for my body, my own cynicism meter and BS meter goes off. And that's because I'm not trying to say I'm more educated than somebody else, but because I use critical judgment when I'm approached with things and with ideas. And this played out last month when you talked about in your piece Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who made an appearance on Sean Hannity's Fox show as the winter storm left a state, left people without water, without heat. A child froze to death of hypothermia in the state of Texas, but the governor's message to his constituents focused on the Green New Deal and how deadly it would have been for the country during the disaster. What did you make of the governor's intention in shifting the focus to the mismanagement of his state's power structure to the Green New Deal, which has nothing to do with his state at this point?
Right, exactly. I mean, this is why I've started to think of cynicism as kind of a way of looking away, essentially, because to me, what Governor Abbott was doing was reckoning with a problem that was right there in front of our eyes, that was so obvious. You know, a humanitarian crisis, essentially, is what was happening in Texas. And, you know, there was no way that he could deny that it was happening. It was being documented in real time. So for me, when he tried to change the focus to the Green New Deal, that was a way of telling people or suggesting to people that they could look away from the disaster and look away from all of the suffering that was happening in his state, and to say, no, 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 what really deserves your focus is AOC or is socialism or is, you know, all of these other things that, you know, people will be upset about and be outraged about. And he was, I think, trying to change the focus back to that. And it reminded me, I have to say, a little bit of what we saw when children at the border were torn away from their parents, were put into cages. And there was a significant section of conservative media, I will say, I think it was mostly concentrated there, where people started to say, no, 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 those are child actors. This crisis is not really happening as it's being portrayed on the news. This is a manipulation. This is an act. And a lot of people came to believe that the children in the cages were acting and were trying to change the story. And to me, what Governor Abbott was doing was a little version of that, where you try to sort of change the focus. You try to say to people, you don't have to look at this thing. You can look at this other thing. And that's the real story. And that's where the wise people will put their attention. And I think so much of this really is about sort of weaponized attention and a knowledge that attention kind of means everything. Attention is such a currency in this moment. And it's, I think, politics and politicians trying to say, this is what deserves your attention, not this.
It's a fascinating piece. It's called American Cynicism Has Reached a Breaking Point. It's in The Atlantic. Megan Garber, always great to have you. Thank you very, very much.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be with you.